My name is Rachel Bond. I previously worked with USAID for a number of years. I was based in what is now E3. So just to give you a little bit of an overview and try and answer these questions. So I think most people, again, are familiar with CBA and the idea that it uses tools from welfare economics. You add and aggregate the costs of doing a project and the benefits you get from it. So that can be applied to a project, it can be applied to a policy reform, that kind of thing. The principal advantage is that it allows you to see if a project is sound, both financially and economically, and we can talk a bit about the distinction there. But it also allows you to compare across projects, so different alternatives, including the status quo, and it allows you to do so in kind of a comparable unit. And usually that's considered the net present value or the internal rate of return. We don't have to go into that in too much depth, but the idea is that it is comparable across different projects and different sectors. And the idea is that this could work for ag. You could think about it particularly for things that are market oriented, so things where there's prices, and ag production and ag technologies, that tends to work pretty well. So oftentimes you'll see cost benefit analysis used by places like ministries of public works or ministries of finance. You might have come across it in work with even your host governments. What you may not know is that CBA can also speak to questions of sustainability and scalability. So kind of breaking it into its different components. The first piece of a CBA is going to be your financial analysis. And that is, again, you're thinking about the financial cash flows over whatever your determined appropriate horizon is, and that's going to be for all of your different stakeholders. So in an ag production project, you'd typically be thinking about a farmer. Maybe you have more than one representative kind of farmer, so maybe one in a region, another in another region where you're working where maybe the agroclimatic differences are pretty stark, that kind of thing. You might be thinking also about your aggregator or your processor, and then you might also want to think about the government. And then you need the whole project, kind of where you're aggregating everybody all together. What you want to do is look at the financial incentives. There's not the proper financial incentives. It's going to be very difficult to convince people to adopt and go beyond, say, pilot to scale. You'd want to look at that from, again, any kind of business perspective, in particular the private sector actors. They will have the clearest incentive to stop participating. You know, you might get a co-op to participate for a couple of years where there's direct cash assistance, but after that it might break down once the project is ended. So that's very important. Another thing you'd want to think about is the economic analysis. The economic analysis is going to be thinking about maybe some of the things that you don't put into market prices, but that might be, pollution or things that are things that don't necessarily come priced in right away, and you'd want to think about. If it's not an economically sustainable project, meaning that it makes society overall better, we might want to think twice about whether or not we want to be encouraging our government to support this kind of project. The third component is a distribution analysis, and this is where you're kind of thinking through exactly what it means for each stakeholder. Again, for example, if the government is going to have a very hefty bill to foot, or we're going to be exacerbating the cost of subsidies, you may not be modeling them, but you might want to think about, if we introduce a project to get people to stop copying seed, somebody's going to lose out on that, and what are their likely, actions that they're going to take and influence the project. And the final component is a risk analysis. So with the beauty of Excel and these models, you can actually build in different assumptions. So what happens if the yields don't go up as much as we think they do? What happens if drought happens one year? What happens if we don't get farmers to adopt as quickly as we thought we would? And you can see what that does to not only the incentives and the overall project performance, but it might help you adjust the way the project is designed. And this is also particularly important as you're going through this process and working with colleagues. It shouldn't just be the job of an economist to do a CBA. You should really be talking to your colleagues, in this case, in agriculture, maybe nutrition. You want to talk to some of the people who are the sociology folks who might be able to say, that's really not the way this works in this farming community. You might want to have to think about, different behavioral issues. So then you add all those components together, and hopefully you can see where and how CBA kind of gives you a sense of just how quickly to scale. It can also, inform and help set targets. It can help you ground your assumptions about how many people you're going to reach and how many communities, and the sustainability of that. So it's a bit of an iterative process. You might be using data from, say, previous projects, the M&E data, and that can give you a sense of just how much further you can go, how you can reach, especially if you're going from, say, a pilot. So there are several features and ways that it plays into scale and sustainability.
Sounds fabulous. Sounds like it does everything. What would be some of the pitfalls that we may want to look out for?
CBA is, as I mentioned, it really does the best job when you're talking about things that are kind of market-oriented, where there's a price. And so if you're thinking about scaling a project and the major benefit is gender inclusion, it's going to be very difficult to use that tool to tell you which project has the best effect in addressing typically females. So that would be one drawback. The other reality is CBA, like project design, it takes time, it takes effort, and you need a lot of data, which, again, this is part of the project design process that should all be there. But if you haven't thought about using CBA as you're already going through this process, you might have to go through it kind of a second time, a second round, and of course that just requires resources.
So it's something you do at the very beginning.
The idea is you use it throughout the project cycle. You would start at the beginning, and you can use it to ideally choose between different projects. Maybe your goal is to increase farm incomes for farmers in a certain region. You might have several different technologies that could get you there. So you'd think about which way is the best to do it, ideally in a least cost method. After, halfway through, you might want to think about, okay, well, the project we selected, the technology we selected, are we performing as we thought, or are we on track? And are there things that we need to adjust? So we thought we would get farmers to adopt much more quickly than we're seeing. What are the problems? Maybe we need to go back and adjust our behavioral teaching, technical assistance, extension, whatever that might be. And then at the end of the project, you can ideally use it to go back and say, okay, were we right? Did we achieve what we thought we were going to achieve? What can we do differently next time? Or is this a project that really performs so well, we might think about taking it to different communities within a region, taking it nationally, that kind of thing.
Sounds like you're getting into the area of monitoring and evaluation a bit with this, right? So, the CBA, do you do M&E with CBA?
I think there's a lot of overlap. So for instance, the process of CBA, you're really just kind of putting numbers against what your project logic is, and those nodes, those kind of logic nodes, are probably the things you would want to be measuring through your M&E plan, or at least some of them.